Hello, everyone. Um, I'm here to warmly welcome you to this very exciting and popular book chat. So we're going to get started. It's 5 after, and we have, I think, quite a lot to say and discuss. My name is Rebecca Lemon, and I'm the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities here at USC. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about Viet Thanh Nguyen's newest book, To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other, which has just appeared with Harvard University Press in 2025. We do invite everyone who's able to please turn on their cameras. I know this is a Zoom event and it can be very tempting, of course, to have off that camera, but it is a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends who are here to support Viet's work. Joining us today are commentators Richard T. Rodriguez, the professor of Media and Cultural Studies and English at the University of California, Riverside, and Saree Makdisi, professor of English at UCLA. The conversation will be moderated by our colleague at USC, Natalia Molina, who is Distinguished Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and Dean's Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Department of English, the Department of Comparative Literature, and the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. Our program today is quite simple. We'll start with a very short introduction to the book by Viet. Then he will be in conversation with Richard and Saree for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. At that time, Natalia will open the floor to questions from everyone. You will be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand, please. So Viet, many congratulations on your wonderful book. Please tell us about it.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. It's so nice to be introduced by you. We were just talking backstage about how we've known each other for so long. Like, I think I was hired the year before you were hired, so it's been at least 27 years, I believe. And thanks to everybody who has agreed to participate in this event and everyone out there. I see many names that I recognize, and I'm grateful for your comradeship and intellectual companionship over the last few decades. Well, for those of you who don't know, this book is a series of 6 lectures I gave at Harvard under the rubric of the Norton Lectures, which I knew nothing about when the invitation arrived. And unfortunately, I'm pretty much a born and bred academic, because when I receive academic invitations, my first response is like, yeah, I'll do it, and then regret it immediately as I realize it's going to take up an entire year of my life. And it's a very peculiar format because these are lectures, so they're not academic essays. They're addressed to a very general audience at Harvard, so not just the faculty and the students, but also the community as well. And there's a whole genealogy of the Norton Lectures, who they bring out there, and so on. The most important thing for me to remember was that the last person who was a literature person who gave the Norton Lectures was Toni Morrison. And then I started looking at it more and realizing the other people who had given these lectures, starting with T.S. Eliot and going on through Jorge Luis Borges and Cesar Milos and many other incredible people. And I thought, this is way too premature for someone like me to give this lecture. But then again, I never turned anything down. So it was a challenge to try to figure out what to talk about, and how to talk about it. And what I decided to do was that these lectures are really, I think, the culmination of an arc that began for me, both in my childhood autobiographically, but also intellectually at Berkeley. So it's great to have Ricky, I know him as Ricky Rodriguez here, because we were both undergraduates at Berkeley at the same time, taking similar classes, being immersed in the same environment of intellectual, theoretical, political provocations. And I recently rediscovered an essay, my first theoretical work that I'd written for one of my senior seminars with David Lloyd, a former colleague of mine here at USC, and also my professor at Berkeley, and now Ricky's colleague at Riverside. But that essay was the use of Edward Said's Orientalism as applied to Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American. So this 20-page essay that I just rediscovered was my first attempt to grapple with the issues that would eventually be in this Norton collection, which are issues around otherness, otherness of identity, otherness of politics, culture, and so on, and how that affects writers and critics and scholars. And I wrote about these types of things and spoke about them not in the objective way that I think all of us who are academics here have been trained to do, but in a way that was both theoretical and objective, but also deeply personal and emotional and autobiographical. And that just reflects the fact that, for me, as I wrestled with these issues as a graduate student and as a professor, I dealt with them as a scholar, but also as someone who wanted to be a writer, and as someone who could never extricate his autobiography of his own otherness from the material that he was discussing. And so there's a strong autobiographical component to these lectures, narrative component, a lot of memories from my own life and my parents. And the book is, marked by a transition from the previous book that I had written, A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial, which I summarize in lecture two, which is basically an adaptation of A Man of Two Faces. The rest of the book is new material, but they are less lectures that draw from these long concerns I've had about how to grapple with duality, with being a minority, with questions of the canon, with genocide and colonization. There's a whole lecture on Palestine and Gaza that I gave on, I think it was like November 10th. So 4 weeks after October 7th. It wasn't in the plan to give this lecture, but I felt I had to respond to what was happening in Gaza and its connection to literature and how literature has always, been able to respond to these horrifying questions of genocide and colonization and where to take a stand. The last lecture is on the joy of otherness. So each of the lectures is on something and related to otherness. And I never wanted to write about the joy of otherness, but one of my good friends, Min Song, when he heard I was writing this book, I'd give him the outline of the lectures, and he said, the last one should be about joy. And I'm like, I don't want to write about joy. I'm a pessimist. And it was actually, the hardest chapter, hardest lecture for me to write. But I'm actually very grateful to Min for giving me that provocation, because in the final lecture on the joy of otherness, it is not a sentimental lecture, I hope. It is not one about joy and hope and happiness and all that. It is about those things, but how they are inextricably related in my life to grief. I would not know joy if it wasn't for grief. I would not be in the position that I am in today as a writer and a scholar if I hadn't been a refugee, and on and on and on. So even with these, for me, the culmination of writing this set of lectures was not only to dwell on the darkness and the pain and the tragedies that have produced otherness, but how these types of historical events have also produced literature and poetry and beauty and joy as well. That's it for me. And I think Natalia is going to call on the first person to be a respondent.
Good if we decided who was going first. Did we?
I don't know who's going first. Yeah.
Ricky, we'll do it in order of knowing time we've known Viet. So, Professor Rodriguez, will you please start us off?
All right. So thank you for the invitation. It's great. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm really excited to be talking about Viet's work with Viet and some recognizable friends here. So I'm just really, really excited. And I also have to say that I just enjoyed the book tremendously. And as Viet was saying, a lot of the moment at which we were undergraduates at Berkeley, informed the writing of some of these essays, and that was something that I zeroed in on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, particularly because the question of otherness here, I believe, is deeply concerned with some of the things that we were concerned with as undergraduates, and I think that's reflected in the citation and engagement with literary works from a diverse range of ethnic, racial, and cultural traditions or genres, as it were. So Gloria Anzaldúa, Derek Walcott, Zora Neale Hurston, Edward P. Jones, and many, many others. And so while Asian American literature is certainly the tradition with which you're engaged and in which your own work is situated, could you maybe talk a little bit about the influence of multi-ethnic literature in general? Because at that moment at Berkeley, I remember taking a multi-ethnic literature class with Xiaoling Wang, and it seemed like we were kind of reading the literature that was reflective of our own particular identities, but we didn't stop short there. We were engaged with what was going on in other traditions as well, taking classes with Barbara Christian, for example, and then also having classes taught by Alfred Arteaga on Shakespeare, which totally brought a totally different perspective on Shakespeare. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about those influences, Viet.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Asian American literature and becoming an Asian American at Berkeley, right around the time I met you, was obviously deeply important to me. It gave me the political motivation, artistic motivation, the spark of energy that turned me into a scholar and gave me the legitimacy to decide I could become a writer. You know, I grew up with these refugee shopkeeper parents. My mom had only had grade school education. My father had high school education. They had no idea what I was doing in school, and so you know to even become a scholar was hard to explain. But except PhD had doctor in it, and you could become a professor. Those things they understood and they respected. But to be a writer was completely alien, and I never told them I wanted to be a writer. And so, you know, Asian American literature, because it featured faces like me and stories about people like my parents, I thought there's a political possibility to this artistic ambition that I had. But I never forgot that I had grown up in a very multicultural environment. I grew up in San Jose, California in the 70s and 80s, neighborhood of white working class people, my Vietnamese refugees, Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. And my first ethnic studies class at UC Riverside when I was a freshman was actually Intro to Chicano Studies. You know, and so when it was time to choose a major, I was an English major, but I chose an ethnic studies major as well because I didn't want to be an Asian American studies major. I thought Asian American studies was important, but what was also important was interracial solidarity and empathy for other groups and so on, things that I was fighting for at that time as an activist too. So it was really crucial to take, you know, Black studies, Chicano studies, Native studies, decolonizing studies, women's studies at Berkeley. And so all of that informs my conceptions of otherness, along with this idea that otherness is an opportunity and a bind all at the same time. And we all of us, I think, have grappled with this, that, you know, we, in words of Gatsby Spivak, we cannot not want our identities. These things have been imposed on us by history and politics and economics and war and so on. So we have to grapple with them. And yet they're also binds as well. And that paradox is nothing to reject, right? I mean, for me, it's the paradox that constitutes my particular form of alienation in the environment of global capitalism and colonialism and war. And it's a paradox that needs to be worked through. And that's what otherness signifies, right? It's not just a cultural and political form of otherness and opportunity. It's a form of otherness that links us, or me, to these histories of war and colonization and capitalism, so that there's no maneuver that I can do as a scholar and as a writer that's not already embedded in these types of problems and opportunities. I mean, so just you know, one example here in the United States, I'm seen as a Vietnamese American writer, as an Asian American writer, which is fine. Although I've said repeatedly, if that's the case, then F. Scott Fitzgerald is a white male American writer. You know, so adjectives for all or adjectives for none. And when I go to Paris and I go to, you know, the bookstores in Paris, you know, to the BHV department store, which has a huge bookstore, I'm under Anglo-Saxon literature. So it's a totally, you know, like there, I'm freed from the binds of being Asian American, whatever that means. But it's equally problematic to be then incorporated into this universal idea of the Anglo-Saxon as well. So there's nowhere we can go, or I can go, that I can escape the problems and the paradoxes of this otherness. And so, yeah, the book is very much about, these lectures are very much about grappling with what that means for the writers that I've admired and also for myself.
I think this kind of picks up on some of those things that you just mentioned. Your reflections on authenticity, which I find deeply refreshing here, particularly at a moment when it feels like, at least to me, a return to essentialisms of various kinds, and oftentimes for good reason or good reasons, but dubious for how sometimes it forecloses the possibilities for coalitions, for example. On page 100, I just want to read this one sentence here. Suspicious of authenticity, having been accused of being inauthentic many times, I suspect that in the end, what my writing will uncover about myself or my many selves is that I am authentic only to my own inauthenticity. So, you know, I think this is just part of that double bind of otherness that comes throughout each one of these lectures slash essays. You know, where you're talking about how inauthenticity is kind of dependent on authenticity, and vice versa. But there's also that undoing of authenticity, which I find extremely valuable.
Yeah. No, authenticity is, you know, undoubtedly has tremendous pleasures. And I don't think any of us really want to walk away completely from that authenticity. Like I'm here in San Jose. The moment I'm done with this, I'm going to go find the most authentic Vietnamese food I can find. All right. So I believe in that. So there are ways in which authenticity is absolutely crucial to our cultural and political ways and of organizing ourselves in our communities and art and politics and so on. But at the heart of authenticity, obviously, is inauthenticity. Both as, I mean, it's a necessary constitutive element. Every idea of there's no such thing as a singular possibility. You always have to have at least a binary that unravels itself. And so, having been marked as inauthentic from a very young age by my fellow Vietnamese Americans, I always was suspicious of what authenticity actually meant. And so, not just at a personal level, but obviously as we look at literature, culture, politics, revolution, war, the idea of the inauthentic is not simply a way of marking in groups and out groups and tastes and values and so on, but there are ways of organizing power and violence too. And so what you can witness on the playground as a kid growing up in an immigrant or refugee experience where some kids are in and some kids are out based on notions of authenticity extends, it's not too far of a leap to say, to these, ways by which entire communities and populations are marked and targeted for demonization, deportation, exclusion, violence, and so on. And that's also reflective in the literature that I've dealt with, and the literature that I've written, that in literature and storytelling, I think the sentimental way of thinking about these things is that the literature and storytelling is there to save us. That's how I felt growing up as a refugee and being immersed in stories and all of that. And that's the narrative I think that we give as scholars of the humanities. The humanities will save us, stories will save us. And then I had to come to this understanding that because of the functions of otherness, stories can also destroy us as well. Sometimes because those stories are manipulated for purely political purposes, as they are today in the narratives of what is the United States, what is American culture. But I think it also happens in canonical literature at the highest levels of art as well. And so there's an example I cite in these lectures of Chinua Achebe encountering the novel Mr. Johnson by a white man, Englishman living in Africa, writing about Black people, and Achebe and his fellow, students, Nigerian students, are laughing because they can't believe the depiction that they're seeing in this book themselves. And all of us who have been marked as other in some way have had that moment, I think, that shock of misrecognition that we have seen of ourselves reflected in, or expressed in someone else's work. The inauthenticity of that representation is something to be laughed at in shock, until we realize that inauthentic representation is also what's being used to mobilize all kinds of power against us as well. Exploitative power, economic power, political power, military power. And so the inauthentic and the authentic is, we tend to talk about it perhaps in purely cultural terms, but I think it's also, they're also functions of dangerous power as well.
Yeah. And this leads me to my next point, the discussion of minor versus major that surfaces in the book. And I really love how you show us how you can look for the minor in what may count as the major, turning to Deleuze and Guattari and mentioning Kafka and thinking about, what's minor about Kafka. And so it's similar to authenticity and inauthenticity. What you're doing is you're breaking down these terms which oftentimes are seen as in distinct contrast to one another, so that there is this really fascinating and important interplay between major and minor.
Yeah, and I remember writing in one of my undergraduate theses to my romanticism professor, all writers want to be major. And he wrote this sort of skeptical note saying, really, is that true? And I thought, yeah, of course, everybody wants to be part of the canon. That was what I thought when I was 18 or 19 or 20 years old. And I think, when I wanted to become a writer, and whatever that meant, I had aspirations for the major, to be major, to be a part of the canon and so on. And part of my education as a writer and facing the discipline of the art itself, which is an experience I think that scholars may have a hard time understanding. Scholars who are only scholars, you have never had to deal with trying to write a novel or a poem. To me it's ultimately a spiritual experience as well as an artistic experience. You have to learn the craft and the technique and all these other kinds of things about the art, but you also have to learn about, I had to anyway, learn about myself. And I think the greatest realization, the most freeing realization that I had about 25 years into trying to become a writer was that all these other things that I thought were major, the canon, the prizes, the recognitions, and all those, they were important. but they were also unimportant. And if I was trying to write for those things, I was going to delude myself and destroy the art. And so being willing to embrace writing just for myself, which is maybe the ultimately minor thing you can do is write for an audience of one, was enormously freeing and was what allowed me to become the writer that I so far have been able to become. And so that lecture on the major and the minor is really about, the ways by which institutions and disciplines like literary criticism and scholarship, but also our cultural institutions like our foundations and however we establish canons, um, those are about the major. They are about recognizing people or accomplishments, and that's important. But so many of these people who have been recognized were actually minor in their own lives, minor in their own deaths. And the fact that they were able to produce anything that was recognized as major later was at least partly because of their conditions of being forced to be minor or willing to embrace being minor, in terms of those artists who are willingly avant-garde or willingly writing things that are obscure. And I find that very inspiring, actually. I find it much more inspiring to look at the so-called minor writers or the writers at the stage when they were minor versus thinking about them when they became major. Because it's when they were minor that they were actually really compelling, really interesting, really problematic in so many different ways and generative in their possibilities. So again, with the inauthentic and the authentic, this really is really difficult to escape from the lures of the major and all that means. And I struggle with it all the time, but I still hold on to that fantasy, a necessary fantasy that being minor is what really counts.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Saree. I don't want to monopolize too much of the time. So yeah.
Thanks, Ricky.
Thanks, Ricky, for those perceptive questions because you set me up very nicely. And thank you, Viet, for writing this amazing book, which is in and of itself sort of in a placeless and timeless way a brilliant book. But in the moment we're in America right now, it's has all the more value because people are looking for alternatives to the very strongly dominant discourse of inclusion, exclusion, all the kind of binaries that you're playing with, productively and provocatively are, as we all know, taken far too much for granted by powerful forces in the US. So this is like an antidote for our own time, and apart from everything else. I want to begin. I mean, some of my questions are gonna build on the ones that Ricky was asking, but I want to begin with a kind of general question. And for those in the audience who haven't read the book, I really encourage you strongly to read it because it's, as I said, it's the book for our time in all kinds of ways. But I want to begin with threads that run through the whole book, but and you connect them off and on at different moments. But I want to just ask you to bring them together here, which is the relationship between condition state of being of the exile, for example, the refugee, depending on how one wants to talk about that, and then location or place, right? What is the relationship between a condition of exile and a place of displacement, loss, marginalization? However, what is the relationship of the exile to a home that maybe he's never going to go back to, or to a new home that maybe he's not going to fit in quite so perfectly? Yeah, let's just start with that and see what you think about that, because obviously this is something you've thought about beyond the context of this book, but I'm just wondering about that relationship as you see it between condition and location.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, lots of echoes of Said's, Reflections on Exile, which was an essay I read when I was like 20 that had, a huge impact on me and still does. And, I'm actually in San Jose, and every time I go to San Jose, I make it a point to visit my parents' graves or whatever in the cemetery. And it's a cemetery that is really a place of exile because so many Vietnamese people are buried in this cemetery. It's a Catholic cemetery that they have whole plots named after the Vietnamese. So there used to be a place where it was called Đất Thánh Việt Nam, or Vietnamese Holy Land, which that was what there when my parents were buried, and now it's gone. I have no idea what happened. I think it was replaced by another sign called Our Lady of Lavang. Our Lady of Lavang is the Vietnamese apparition of the Virgin Mary in Vietnam. So anyway, I bring this up as a metaphorical example because all these Vietnamese people were exiled as refugees because of the war. And and when I was growing up, my father was always telling me we're 100% Vietnamese. But yet he nevertheless chose to be buried here in the United States versus buried in Vietnam, which, he had the opportunity to do that, to go home and be buried if he wanted to. And so, the location, this place, for the Vietnamese refugee community, they as much as they've held on to the idea of the Vietnam they lost, most of them have now spent more time in the United States than they ever did in Vietnam. And so many have chosen to be buried here versus in Vietnam. And I can't help but think that the condition that they've experienced as the refugee condition or exiled condition has been ameliorated by their attachment to place, and ameliorated in both good ways and bad ways. The good ways, I think, are pretty obvious, but the bad ways are that the attachment to a place can generate the desire for authenticity. Now, if the place that you're attached to is somewhere else, where you've been exiled from, the authentic connection to that can be very powerful and form the exilic community. And it can also form regressive forms of cultural nationalism. So I grew up at a time in the 80s where Vietnamese people were murdering other Vietnamese people for not having the right kinds of politics about their relationship to the homeland, right? That's not unusual at all. And then now you see Vietnamese refugees who are saying, we were the good refugees. These other people are the bad refugees who are trying to get in. We need to keep them out. And so their attachment to a new place, this new homeland of the United States, has led them to another politics of authenticity, nostalgia, sentimentalism, where they've gone from one kind of nationalism that was Vietnamese nationalism to another kind of nationalism, American nationalism. So the Vietnamese nationalism in exile, that condition that you were describing, then morphs into another kind of nationalism that's attached to this new place. And so, the attachment to place can be it's so varied depending upon the condition. And I think that's why the question of the condition that you raise is so important, and the one that Saeed raises is so important, because what's necessary is to hang on to the nature of being exiled and of being a refugee. Not to idealize those conditions, but at least they foment the possibilities of skepticism around authenticity and origins. Now, that's a very fragile kind of possibility, because I think for many human beings, perhaps most, when they're put into conditions of displacement, they want to get rid of those conditions and find a place. And so the place that they find is a rooted place, whereas the part of the argument that Saeed makes and that I make is that instead, the politics of possibility are found in the unrooted conditions of exile and the refugee experience, which no one chooses, really. It's forced on us. But the fact that it's been forced on us gives us this historical opening to realize how potentially problematic, the notions of roots and attachments and place happen to be. And so even as it's inevitable that exiled and refugee communities find places to stay, I think it's necessary for the refugee and exile artists and intellectuals and other kinds of artists and activists to hang on to the historical possibility that's been open to them because of an imposed condition where they can see the problems and the necessities of place all at the same time. And so that's why I think, I can't tell if it's with this book or Man of Two Faces, but the end of these works is very much about embracing the negative possibility of what it means to be in exile or to be a refugee. So what we see with this, the idea that there's all this deportation that's happening and people are being cast out. We see the reverse reaction with people claiming that they're Americans and so on. And all that is necessary. And that's partly because, refugees and exiles are seen as terrifying figures, because what they embody is having been cast out of the nation state and its possibilities for belonging and citizenship. But the argument that I make at the end of these two books is those refugees and those exiles, their nothingness that is so threatening and horrifying is also the sign of a possibility of a totally different world order. Okay, so that's a genealogy I think I share with Saeed from Reflections on Exile, and my way of trying to talk about refugee and exilic experiences without sentimentalizing them, valorizing them, or praising the nation state as what is really needed as a solution to refugee and exilic conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant, and it sort of captures in a way what the gift of the book, which is to say a condition or situation or location that looks like it's curse or a problem, which actually historically was a curse. Like to be exiled was the worst punishment in the ancient world. You can now, people like you are able to turn around and say yes, but it's also a gift. And you talk a lot about how, you know, the burden of otherness is also can be transformed into, it could be a curse, but it could be a gift as well, and it can be incredibly productive, you know, in that sense too. But I want to turn to another term that I think you don't talk about so much, although I could be mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, which is the diaspora, because it's like there's a kind of, so you have exile and refugee, which you've talked about now. Diaspora, that like in a way, almost the difference between exile and refugee is that those are individual figures. I mean, although refugee has the sense of a collective, maybe, but diaspora is like a larger, you know, cultural or social formation too. It's almost necessarily collective. So do you like, how do you think, I mean, so much of this book is about being a writer, right? Being a writer is, yeah, you can be part of a community, but by definition, at the end of the day, you're going to have to go home and lock yourself up and write the books. Otherwise, that's what it means to be right. There's the kind of solitariness in writing, almost inevitably, at least for me, there is. I'm not a writer like you, but that's my sense of it. But sorry, so just to stop rambling, how do you like? Do you think diaspora as a concept is useful here? And I'm thinking in particular of Stuart Hall's work on diaspora, because he, again, I would say he lines up with you in all kinds of ways in the sense that diaspora, which seems like being outcast, actually is incredibly generative. And in some ways, you know, at least intellectually, if not physically or materially, has advantages over placedness or, you know, rootedness in some other kind of sense.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I don't think I realized I didn't talk about diaspora. And maybe the reason why I didn't talk about diaspora is I think the notions of being an exile and a refugee just have such explicitly political meanings attached to them that diaspora doesn't necessarily have for all communities at this present moment. With all due respect to Stuart Hall's arguments, which are obviously really, really important. When I talk about Said, I talk about how in Reflections on Exile, Said privileges the modernist exile, and the figure of the writer in particular. And he describes the refugee in that essay as being a part of a herd. I think that's the language he uses, a herd, which is perfect. And so, to be a refugee is to be part of a mass, is to be part of, it's very difficult to distinguish oneself as an individual refugee. You're just part of a mass, part of a herd. And that the condition of being a part of this agglomeration of unwanted, despised people is a political condition, whether one wants it or not. I think diaspora has almost a softer connotation now. The roots of the idea of the diaspora and the Jewish diaspora obviously are not in any way innocent, but yet it's been such a term that's been adopted by so many different communities to describe such varied historical experiences and political experiences that I think it just didn't have any more charm for me by the time I wrote this book. And so I'm trying to distinguish, it's a great question you asked, like, why did it become so unimportant to me that it didn't even occur to me to bring it up? I think it's become like I helped to co-found an organization called the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. So for us, that idea of the diaspora was sort of a politically neutral term in some ways that wasn't as threatening as saying that we were the refugee network of Vietnamese writers or something like that. And it wasn't as pretentious as saying we were the exilic Vietnamese writers. So diaspora, I think at this particular conjunction of time has again more of a cultural sense. I'm not saying that exhausts all of its possibilities, but I think that for me was where the term had seemed to have reached its political exhaustion in the present moment. But maybe you have a different take on that.
No. I mean, I'm just I mean, actually, the way you put it in terms of the Vietnamese Writers Network, in fact, it is the kind of, as soon as you use the word diaspora, you're automatically talking about a collective. I just think it's interesting as a term that comes up in terms of the possibilities of political organizing, for example, which has a different valence than either exile or refugee. There's something else about the constitution of a new kind of community. It's almost like there's a collective knowledge, a collective identity, but it's different than that of exiles or refugees. But one last question I wanted just to ask you, Viet, because one of the most important essays in the book, I think, is the one on Palestine in Asia, the relationship between Palestine and Asia, Asian Americans, and your really powerful call for the role of what you call, I think it's page 50, expansive solidarity, rather than self-defense and inclusion, which is an understandable drive for Asian Americans, all kinds of historical circumstances, maybe including this one too, the one we're in now. But I wonder whether you want to think now that, I mean, you wrote that piece, I think 2 months maybe into the genocide in Gaza. Now here we are 2 years later. And also these questions of refugees, exiles, etc. I mean, that also has enormous relevance for the question of Palestine. So do, do you look back and like, what do you think about that essay and the place of Palestine in American thought, especially Asian American thought, but American thought in general
Yeah.
today, given these questions?
I think I spent a summer like coming up with the 6 titles for the lectures, and the original title for that lecture was on the death of Asian Americans. And I wanted to think about violence and racism and the way in which for Asian Americans death has always been present. I mean, the very reason, arguably, that Asian Americans even exist is as a response to imposed death through structural violence done against Asian immigrants and refugees. And then October 7th happened, and again, I felt like I needed to respond, and the next lecture was on the death of Asian Americans. So I wanted to, it forced me, that occasion forced me to go back to Said, and the fact that my first act, really as a young budding scholar, was writing this essay on the Quiet American by Graham Greene using Orientalism. I don't think it even really occurred to me when I was 19 writing that essay what Palestine meant. I think I just extracted Orientalism out of it. I extracted this general idea of the Orient that so many of us Asian Americans were using at that time, and it became, that Orientalism became a way for Asian American studies to organize itself around questions of representation, inclusion, colonialism, and racism, in an almost ahistorical way. Like we just severed off part of Said's argument and just located the part that was relevant to the United States and to East and Southeast Asia. So the essay was for me a personal reckoning with my own intellectual and political genealogy. And again, it's not a matter of like inclusion, like, oh, now how do we talk about the Palestinians? It was like, once we start acknowledging what Said was arguing and the way that his own intellectual and political genealogy was inseparable from both the histories of European canonization and European imperialism and what was happening in Palestine, then it became so much more obvious, in fact, that it was not a matter of just trying to include Palestinians in Asian American studies, but in fact thinking about how Palestine and Asian America itself are both produced from the same welter of global and historical forces around colonization and global exploitation with different manifestations. And again, going back to the bind of otherness that we started off with, again, part of the bind of otherness that happens is once we become attached to our otherness and we give it a name, whatever that is, in this case, Asian Americans, it empowers us, and it also precludes us from seeing other connections. Like, why did we even exist as an other in the first place? And so that was what the essay was about, was trying to, again, create out these connections, not to, in order to foment a kind of alliance or solidarity of identities, but to foment a recognition of like the genealogy of genocide, which is masked by certain forms of commodified and included otherness, such as being Asian American, right?
Yeah.
And so if I were to do this again, which I probably will at some point, the essay would not be about on Palestine and Asia. It would just be straight up about Palestine and genocide and colonization. And it would have to be a much longer essay about how that history works so that it eventually produces this fragmentation between between Palestinians and other kinds of related populations like Asian Americans. But I will say that even writing that essay was provocative enough at the time. It was the only essay I got booed at Harvard for giving. And it's an essay that I thought was really clear, but reading Reddit comments, which I'm not sure I should do, people are like, I don't understand the essay. Like, what's he doing? Talking about Asian Americans and Palestinians in the same circumstances. And so I think that essay could probably be written about many other kinds of others in relationship to Palestine, actually, that kind of intellectual and political work that needs to be done to uncover these kinds of connections is really crucial. And so I'll end by saying that, expansive solidarity, capacious grief, these ideas And the end of that lecture concludes by saying, who should we identify with? We should identify with whoever is the monster, whoever is the other. That's the moral, ethical, and political compass we should have. That goes back to my response to Ricky. Why did I choose ethnic studies instead of Asian American studies? I think I was already aware of that necessity of identifying with whoever is marked as the other versus being attached to one's own otherness. And so that took me to El Salvador in February. And what did I discover in El Salvador in February, besides the fact that I was there in San Salvador with Marco Rubio, literally on the same day that he was signing the deportation agreement 2 miles away from me? I discovered that, the dictator Bukele is actually Palestinian, of Palestinian extraction. I discovered that Palestinians have been there in El Salvador since at least the early 20th century. They're called Turks for some reason instead of Palestinians, and that there were Palestinian revolutionaries against, the dictatorial government during the Civil War. And that Israel supplied, 80% of the weaponry to the Salvadoran army during the late 70s and early 80s during a time. Anyway, it's like once you start to see it, then it's like all these historical connections are possible. And so, part of what colonization does is that it divides and conquers, literally. I mean, obviously, geographically it does, but discursively, theoretically, politically, even the mechanisms within a university that allows resistance of some kind is still fragmented. And that was ultimately one of the takeaways from writing this essay that included the problems of Asian American studies in relationship to Palestine.
Thank you, Viet.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for those insightful questions that led to this generative conversation. We now have until 1, about good 10, 15 minutes to listen to your questions. Maybe it respond. If you just raise your hand, I'm looking at the gallery. The floor is open. I know so many of you here are writing about these topics and teach about them and live them. Hi, Lenita. And then Connie, we'd love to hear from you.
This question is going to seem like it comes out of left field, but bear with me. Hi, Viet.
Yeah.
Good to see you. The Harvard lectures, even your work, what it means to be a writer. Um, the question is, how are you? But it's framed this way, and that is, what does talking about these kinds of truths, diving into your own personal experiences, memories, grief, looking on the flip side of pain to unearth joy, what kind of ethics of care does it impose or compel you to do as a practice, as a writer, as a public figure, as a creative? How are you? How do you do this? Mhm.
Well, thank you for that question. That's very kind. It's a super stressful
Mhm.
experience sometimes,
Yeah.
Yeah, I was 2 years on the road, giving lectures and so on around A Man of Two Faces, which came out in 2021 and no, I'm sorry, 2023, and giving these lectures at Harvard and then promoting the book. And the genocide was taking place, and
Yeah.
I did feel like emotionally exhausted in a lot of ways. And you know, to be a good professor, to be a good teacher, you have to take care of your students. You have to be good in the classroom. To be a good public intellectual, you have to think constantly about whatever's going on, but also one's own implication in the things that are happening at the same time. And I always feel like, no matter how tired or exhausted I might feel, I think about the fact that many of the people that I write about went through much worse circumstances. So the way to answer your question is, an example from the sympathizer. The sympathizer ends up in a hospital. He's been blown up by a bomb attack. And the doctor says, well, if you feel bad, just remember that there's other people who feel worse. That's the best medicine. And so that's what I think about, when we write about these kinds of political issues and so on. Of course, it can be very stressful and we can be exhausted. And I think we all in this room probably feel that way, given the condition of USC and other universities we might find ourselves in. If we are ethical, caring scholars and intellectuals and cultural workers, we should be tired, I think, at this
Mm.
time. What gives me renewal, I guess, is certainly my family, my children. They're growing up to be beautiful people so far, I hope.
Yeah.
It does give me sentimental hope. But also the nurturing and the care of students, the fact that we are witnessing networks of solidarity take place, even under these dire circumstances. People are fighting back both on campus but outside of campus as well. The fact that, you know, the students who were arrested for the Gaza protests have been proven right,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that
Yeah.
may be cold comfort to some, but they've been proven right. So I take heart from all of that, you know, that the things that so many of us are engaged in doing are the right things to do. I take heart from the fact that art is still affirmative for me, that I still take joy from discovering a beautiful poem or reading a good novel or encountering a great artwork. And I recognize that so many of those things have been produced out of people's experiences of otherness. So
Yeah.
artwork itself and scholarship is oftentimes an embodiment of that last lecture, the joy of otherness. We wouldn't have these things if it hadn't been for terrible experiences that people and communities had to go through. And not to trivialize those things, but they've left us with the residue of beauty as well. So I find comfort in that.
Maybe my turn.
Yeah. Hi, Pine.
Hi, thanks, Viet, and hello to everyone. I was just teaching Duras this week, and a particular novel that I had never taught before, entitled "Destroy," she said. And in fact, I just learned that it was originally titled "Destroy," and Alain Robrier, a fellow novelist of the Nouveau Roman, suggested, she said. So I want, and obviously the title of your book is to save and to save and destroy. So can you tell us a little bit about the title and what is obviously meant to suggest, and all these different layers?
That's cool. I'm glad you brought up Duras. I wrote the introduction to the New English version of The Lover. And in doing that, I read her biography, you know, and I was like, oh, you know, I didn't quite realize how much she herself was an other, you know, this white girl, poor white girl, French girl being raised literally in French Indochina. And without that, you know, feeling displaced from both Vietnamese and Chinese societies and from white French societies too. And you know, her experiences of otherness led her to produce stuff that affected me in terms of reading and watching The Lover. You know, her work is very much about, I think, the salvation and destruction that's possible through the experiences of otherness in art. And that likewise for me is like, part of what made me want to become a writer was my sense that art and my sense that literature and storytelling was saving me from the travails of refugee experiences. But that sentimental idea, as important as it is, wasn't enough to make me into a very good writer, or even really give me the conviction that I should become a writer. What gave me the conviction was my realization in college that stories could destroy me too. I mean, I felt that when I was younger, like watching Apocalypse Now or reading, you know, American novels of the Vietnam War with racist depictions of Vietnamese people in them. But I couldn't articulate it till I was in university at Berkeley. And I thought, oh yeah, so if we grant that powers, that stories have so much power that they can save us, we have to grant that they have that same power to destroy. Again, there's no way that power can exist to perform only one function. And so that's what the title is, to save and to destroy. It's a theme that's, I think, present in all of my work. This idea that when we turn to art and the humanities, we can't treat them simply as the way that our universities talk about it in their PR. You know, like it's art and the humanities are produced out of us, which means all of the contradictions, all of the fears, all of the dangers, all the beauties that exist within us exist in the literature and the art as well. And I find actually I'm the kind of personality that finds that gratifying, to think that stories can destroy you. And you know, I haven't read Destroy, she said, but you know, when we say that art destroys us, we mean many things. You know, it can destroy us in a negative way, as happened when we encounter racist and sexist depictions of ourselves, but art can destroy us with its beauty as well. And the capacity of art to do those things can't be disentangled from each other. That's what the title expresses.
Thank you.
I think, Kelly, you're next.
This will
Hi,
be a question also.
hi, so nice to meet you. So I just started teaching this semester, and my writing course, the thematic is globalization, and actually, one of my paper prompts was originally like inspired by a course last spring. Like, so I wanted to make it about Palestine, but I brought my prompt like to the department, and yeah, and kind of to my surprise, like so many faculty just warned me about the risk of doing that in the undergrad writing course. Of course, or my class is a freshman class, and yeah, so many faculty members just warned me about like how would students feel about it, how would they respond, also how it would impact me as an international student worker. And so yeah, so unfortunately I didn't put forward that prompt. I made something more general. So yeah, as your new book is from your series of lectures, and I wonder if you could give us some advice or share your experience on teaching these sensitive political topics in classrooms, and especially in the current environment of America.
Yeah, well, Kelly was a student in my graduate seminar on writing as an other, which included a component on Gaza and Palestine and genocide as well. I think back to my seminars at Berkeley, which were awful. I don't know, Berkeley, I don't know, Ricky, what experiences you had, but they were so stressful. I took decolonization as a seminar with David Lloyd at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, and there was just so much shouting in those seminars, and just, it was so stressful. And so I came out of that experience thinking that this is part of what our work as academics is supposed to be, as teachers and as scholars and as students, is to engage with the issues that will make us shout and get angry and be passionate and denounce each other, and also, converse with each other all at the same time. Um, Professors and scholars have a certain responsibility to figure out how to do that ethically and responsibly in a seminar. But there's also the question of pragmatism. I would never tell anybody such as yourself, just go for it, given all the risks that you obviously are aware of. I've always been a pragmatist, and I've always, tried to mesh that with the idealism as well. But the thing I will say about this is, the reason I became a scholar was I was 21 and I heard of tenure. I'd never heard of tenure. I didn't even know what a professor was. The word professor was never spoken in my household when I was growing up. I had no idea what a professor was. So I got to Berkeley, heard about professors, and then heard professors could get tenure and they had academic freedom. And then I thought, wow, that's what I want, because then you can't get fired. Then I can do whatever I want. I didn't tell anybody at USC this. I was hired to be a professor, as a scholar, and I became a writer instead. That was the plan. Like, I'm going to sneak in, and then I'm going to do whatever I want once they can't fire me. Rebecca's a dean. So I'm sorry, Rebecca, but that was the ambition. But I've taken that to heart because, obviously we live in a moment in which academic freedom is threatened, not just for graduate students and junior cultural workers, but the very most senior professors as well. But I go back to this idea, that generations have fought for this principle of academic freedom, and there has to be people who are willing to stand up and pay the price to speak out and use that freedom. Doesn't have to be you, Kelly. Shouldn't have to be you. It should be people like me. And so that's the obligation of the senior professors, is to lead the way on that and to take the risk. We shouldn't be expecting, graduate students teaching their first class to bring up the most controversial issue. It should be up to the senior professors. So I think I'm teaching my last class at USC in the spring, and I thought I was going to teach it on the end at the topic for my senior seminar. And then as I was trying to write the description a couple of weeks ago, I thought, this is not motivating me. I just can't get the excitement up for this course called The End. And so it became the question of Palestine. So that's the last class. And because it matters to me, and because it brings up a lot of other issues in addition to the genocide and so on, that as I indicated in my response to Saree, that implicates so many other issues that affect the humanities and us as academics. So I don't think I'll get pushback in the way that you're afraid of, Kelly. I have insulation that you don't. But if I do get pushback, then that's the price that, you know, I should be willing to pay. And so I hope that all the other senior professors on this seminar are also feeling that sense of conviction, because we all may be tested willingly or unwillingly at some point in the very near future.
We're grateful to all of you for coming for this rich discussion, and especially to you, Viet, for pushing back in so many ways through your writing, through your scholarship, through your public work. We're grateful to know you, to read your work, and to be in conversation with you. Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to all of you. It's so heartwarming to see so many faces and names that I recognize and I've been friends with for so many decades. Particularly, you know, I do want to thank Ricky, Saree, you, Natalia, Rebecca, my old comrade as well, for giving me this opportunity to have such an intimate and wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.